Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. The past week has been crammed with events in different parts of the world which have been crowding the headlines and crying for attention from international relations experts to analyze them. Some of them are not as large as the full-scale war going on in the European theater between Russia and Ukraine, but cumulatively their impact is likely to be no less important on power equations and the impact on India's national interests in the region. One of the major news items has been the killing in cold blood of an internationally famous journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, in territory occupied by Israelis illegally, where the Palestinians are. And this has created a great furor whether Israel is a rogue state which continues to behave with impunity, riding roughshod over the Palestinian rights, and what is going to happen to Palestinians as a people. Their crisis is a forgotten crisis. No longer one treats Palestinians as a crisis. There's problems as a crisis. They're supposed to be not an epidemic, but an endemic. The world has got used to living with them. And slowly, with the restructuring of the relations between Israel and the Arab countries, the Palestinians seem to have lost support in their Arab fraternity. But we have to think about this carefully. You can't wish away the problems of Palestinians. That is one issue. And the second issue is the rise of populism. And the rise of populism the world over has led to a situation where people say that a new kind of a democracy is appearing. Not democracy, but democratic tyranny. Elected authoritarian regimes which have nothing more to offer to their people but populist slogans. But they seem to continue to get re-elected again and again. And the basic problems of economy and society remain where they are. This is what we witnessed in the Philippines. This is what people are waiting with excitement, bated breath, so to speak, in Bolsonaro's bid for re-election in Brazil. Some would say that Putin himself in Russia is an example of populism and charisma and elected authoritarianism. Some would even include Xi Jinping in it. Some would say that even the Indian Prime Minister and his party have benefited from this trend of populism and vast majority of electorates supporting whatever they seem to offer their people. We'll cover all this, and we'll try to cover some other aspects which are important. The Prime Minister has embarked on a visit to Nepal, and the Nepal-India relationship is one aspect, but this is a good opportunity to examine what is happening to Nepal internally. Is it poised on as disastrous a brink as Sri Lanka because of its economic problems, its dependence on Chinese aid? We'll talk about this as well. So all these things have a cumulative effect on what is going to happen in the world, the new order emerging after the war in Ukraine, or American withdrawal from Afghanistan, or the COVID crisis, or how to cope with the climate change. Slowly, imperceptibly, these changes are already changing the contours of world politics. Let's take, first of all, a look at Shireen Abu Akleh's murder. It is far more important than killing of a single journalist. It raises issues about Israel's blatant, flagrant violation of international law and the rights of the Palestinian people. While the Israelis have denied any hand in this murder killing, they have said that on the contrary, it was the Palestinian terrorists who deliberately killed a journalist of this eminence to create trouble and make it possible to blame Israel. Israel also came out in its defense that its troops had to use brute force because just a few days before Shireen's murder, there have been barbarous attacks through axes and knives on innocent civilians in Israel, and Israel's policy always has been to retaliate against such terrorist attacks in its own territory. Israel's conduct in recent past has been more and more provocative. When the Palestinians have gathered in the Al-Aqsa Mosque for prayers, they have been attacked. And similarly, when this funeral procession of this journalist was being taken out, it was very brutally repressed, and an attempt was made for the mourners to scatter this way or that way. This has created a very bad impression about what the Israelis do. But the Israelis continue to insist that the West and the other countries that pillory Israel follow double standards. They say that almost a dozen journalists have been killed in the war in Ukraine. Does anybody know their name? Why should one journalist killing be singled out and Israel blamed for it? They have also volunteered for the first time at a very high level, at the prime ministerial level, at the foreign minister's level, to offer impartial inquiry into this killing. Now, of course, the Palestinians refuse to accept that any inquiry in which Israeli deep state is involved can be impartial, transparent, and lead to any conclusion. At the same time, they have also said that even if the US makes noises about being an observer or a broker in such an inquiry, they can't be trusted, because they ultimately are the ones who criticize when it becomes almost unbearable. They are the ones who have been supporting the Zionist Jewish forces in Israel. Israel is much too important strategically for the United States of America to dispense with. Although the present regime, the coalition government, is different in temperament and tone from Netanyahu's government, there is also a member representing the Muslim Arabs in this government. But he obviously is only there for tokenism, for symbolic purposes. When asked about this killing, he said that, look, despite whatever happens, I have to remain in the government and expect that something would come out which will be benefiting the interests of the Palestinians. The whole world may condemn, the United Nations may condemn these activities, but it makes no difference. But when it comes to the all-important Human Rights Commission, the Western supporters of Israel keep boycotting the agenda item which raises these issues of Palestinians whenever they are raised in this conference. So this is one part. There are definitely double standards when American soldiers are involved, American journalists are involved. Even in past, when an American Saudi journalist Khashoggi was murdered in Turkey, great hue and cry was raised, but ultimately things have returned to business as normal. Turkey has handed over the inquiry back to Saudi Arab, and of course all the violations of Vienna Convention, diplomatic embassies, consulates has been forgotten. So these are issues which are momentarily controversial, but then they expose to two things: the futility or the importance of the United Nations arrangements to safeguard refugee interests, safeguard human rights, or to see that the rule-based international system is observed. A sovereign state, even as small a sovereign state in Israel, can take on the rest of the international community and behave. But because Israel is a valuable ally geopolitically for the Americans, they don't criticize it as a rogue state like they do something like the North Koreans or the Myanmarese military junta. So the question of double standards which Israelis raise has some validity. The problem is that Israel in the meantime has tried to restore its relationship with other Arab countries. Post-Abraham Accord, it has improved, normalized its relationship with UAE, with Saudi Arab, is likely to improve relationship and normalize relationship. And once this happens, the Palestinians would lose the largest support base they have had in the Arab world. Now, unfortunately, the Palestinian refugees have not been very popular in the states where they have stayed. The Palestinians have always been more cosmopolitan, better educated, more secular in their outlook. Their Islamization of their intifada has only started after the ruthless repression by the Israelis. Otherwise, they were very different from other Arabs in this region. But it is not only this. This issue is also related to Iran's presence in Middle East. Now, Iran is considered a Central Asian country. Among the Muslim community, it's a Shia country, but it also is a country with which USA has had very adverse relationship for decades. This is where, when the Shah was ousted in a coup and the Islamic Revolution took place, the American embassy was besieged, and this is where the confrontation between Islam and Christianity had started. So this has not changed much. We have talked in past, referred in past to the joint comprehensive agreement to manage the nuclear issue, which was signed between Iran and Obama, which Trump had reneged, but it was almost on the verge of being revived when the war in Ukraine interfered. But let's not forget that Israelis have been trying all along to sabotage and wreck this arrangement one way or another by provoking assassinations, sabotage of nuclear installations in Iran, assassination of their top nuclear scientists, their top-notch generals like General Soleimani in Iraq. But Iran has always acted with restraint, thinking that if the nuclear agreement is revived, the sanctions would be slowly withdrawn and Iranian economy would be able to recover. Now let's look at Iranian perspective in this. Iranians have also not tried to remain always restrained. They have used Hezbollah, the army of the God, supported by them in Lebanon, which is used as a sword arm of the Iranians to intervene in the Middle Eastern conflicts. They can be used as a militia. They can be Iran can deny its complicity, but this Hezbollah has trained the rebels in Saudi Yemen who have been targeting Saudi Arab. So there have been incidents when the Israelis are justified in claiming that the Iran's support of Hezbollah is primarily directed against Israel, and Israel's survival is at stake, so they are justified in taking any kind of action against anybody in the war zone. Now, this has been the classic case of Israel, and they also, even in this murder of journalists, say that journalists are no special category. If they enter the war zone, if they are war correspondents, they realize that they are under the same risk as the civilians, and they can be killed, they can become in the crossfire, they can be caught in crossfire and be killed, and no special case can be made about them. Interestingly, Americans had the same position when they were conducting a war, flouting international rule-based system, either in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Syria or in Libya. So they cannot afford to criticize Israelis too much. There is another aspect of this present crisis. Because of the war in Ukraine, the export of wheat has stopped, and because the wheat is piling up in silos, Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to store anymore. The new crop has been cut. The farmers were daredevils, which wore bulletproof jackets, sowed the crop, and because now the Russian troops have withdrawn, they could harvest the crop, but where to store them, where to take them? They can't be shipped out because the Russians control the Black Sea and the major ports in Ukraine. And even if the roads and railroads are tried, there already are 10-kilometer long traffic jams to reach the East European border. Again, Ukraine is not a member of European Union, so the border between member states of European Union and Ukraine are tightly controlled. They are not open borders, although for refugees they have been opened more generously on a humanitarian cause. But unless some such relaxation can take place, this Ukrainian wheat cannot be passed on to Europe and via Europe to other customers in Africa, Egypt, elsewhere. Now, this is also having an impact on Iran, because Iran is divided. The contemporary society in Iran, as observers believe, is divided either among the ultra-rich or among the very, very poor. So somehow or other, so far Iran has survived the sanctions by proving that its economy is very resilient, but how long can it afford to do so is open to question. There have been reports of demonstrations, people clamoring for wheat, bread in the streets. There has been almost 300% inflation in cost of foodstuff like bread, and also other supplies are running short. Iran has also not been able to export its oil, get the requisite foreign exchange, and to buy these things. But here it is not only a question of foreign exchange, it is a question of the supply chain of the wheat having been blocked. This has resulted in India, which had till recently promised needy countries that it would feed them, it would prove to be the breadbasket of the world, has had to eat back its words and impose ban on wheat exports from India, because the priority is to feed Indians, and then the already to keep the agreements with countries where India has already promised that it would, in their immediate neighborhood, supply them their their food grain and resources, but it cannot afford to spread itself too thin. This policy is going to be criticized domestically because it is against the farmers, those who are exporting wheat. They think that their interests are hurt, but there is no easy way out of this. So there is this complex relationship between Israel's almost putting everything at stake for the survival on the ground that it is the survival of the state, Israeli state, that is at risk, and also riding roughshod of the Palestinians, the world forgetting about Palestinians because a new crisis in Ukraine has diverted attention, and Israel has restructured its relationship with countries in UAE. I think as far as India is concerned, one more complication is added here. Whenever we talk in terms of Quads in Southeast Asia, which was a bulwark against Chinese expansionism, but then everybody said it is not a military alliance system, it is basically either climate change or vaccine diplomacy, technology transfers, etc. But nobody talks of the Quads in the West. And the Quads in the West includes United States, Israel, UAE, and India. Now, India has had a very close relationship forged with Israel in recent past, even in terms of supply of military hardware. So, is it the reason that India cannot afford to criticize the Israeli action against Palestinians too sharply? It also has, under American influence, distanced itself from Iran. So it probably, despite a large Shia population, our centuries, millennia old ties with Iran, not take sides between Iran and what is happening between Israel, and slowly we are distancing ourselves. The Prime Minister in the near future is going to visit UAE, where he has always been received with great warmth. He has been accorded the highest civilian honors in UAE, in Saudi Arab. But then, will this mean that Indians are also trying to have a new geo-economical relationship which allows them to pursue its own national interest? The hundreds of thousands of members of Indian diaspora in this region, where they find it convenient, and maybe not only convenient and imperative, to mend its relationship with countries like Qatar, with countries like UAE, countries like Saudi Arab, rather than try to rebuild bridges with Iran. What is it likely to unfold as is difficult to foretell at the moment, with Iran continuously being pushed back into the Chinese corner, Pakistan, Iran, China being on one side, and India again seems to be distancing itself from the Russians. The recent news item has been that Indians are going to reopen their embassy in Kyiv, which had shifted from Ukraine to Poland when the crisis grew. Does it mean that India realizes that Russia is not going to succeed in registering a victory in Ukraine? It has isolated itself. Does it mean that the world is again divided into two blocks, one which supports Ukraine, the other which supports Russia? It is not a question of numbers on one side or the others. International relations experts have suggested that Americans and only their old allies in NATO have succeeded in drawing a cordon sanitaire against Russia, and there again the unanimity of imposing sanctions is not there. Countries who are members of NATO like Turkey have very clearly said that they would oppose the membership applications of Finland and Sweden. Hungary has said that it is expecting to be compensated with hundreds of millions of dollars or euros before they can agree to any more sanctions against the Russians. Their pro-Russian stance is quite clear. So there is this situation. The French president has always been arguing that the EU Constitution Charter should be changed, so not one country should be in a position to exercise a veto on the consensual decisions. Now, India is concerned in all this. India is not a country which can either stand aloof and remain neutral all along. If it takes policy decisions according to its own interests, there would be a trade-off somewhere else. While the world has been focused and apprehensive about whatever is happening in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries, the murder of the Algeria journalists in Palestinian territories, the eyes have been taken off the tip of Africa, where Algeria and Morocco seem to be igniting what is called a gas fire. The relationship between Algeria and Moscow have never been easy. They have been fighting about a border which is disputed. One was a French territory, other was a Spanish controlled territory. But what is more, in recent years, the Algerians have been seen by the Moroccans as supporting the people in Western Sahara, Polisario, and they have been trying to reintegrate them into their own territory, and the border has only helped piracy, smugglers and so on, and there has been a climate of political instability, especially since the French decided that they were going to move out from their peace maintaining role in the northern tip of Africa or the northwest Africa. Now, Algeria is a country which is interesting in more ways than one. The contrast between Algeria and Morocco is quite clear. Throughout the history of Cold War, Morocco was a hypersensitive monarchy, very sympathetic to the West. It was a pleasure ground for the ultra-rich in the West. Algeria, on the contrary, was, after its revolution, was a socialist country tilting towards Moscow, a country Islamic but necessarily in its politics very, very secular. And after a very bloody liberation war, a dictatorship had been established, and only 3 years ago, a 20-year-long reign of Bouteflika was ended. Now, at that stage, people would have thought that Algeria was turning a new page, and it would probably play an important role in the politics of Africa and in the region. Let's not forget that Algeria is also an oil and a gas producing country, and at the moment, part of the problem between Algeria and Morocco is because of the gas also. Algeria supplies 40% of Spain's gas through a pipeline which passes through Morocco. Morocco, till very recently, used to claim 7% as the royalty of this. Recently, Morocco provoked Algerians by telling the Spanish that they should turn back reset the valves and send back some of the gas supplied through Morocco to Spain back to Morocco. When this came, the Algerians were aroused to anger, and they said that if Spain does that, they will even cut the supply to Spain of the gas through a pipeline which bypasses Morocco. So Morocco has obviously taken the lead in provoking Algerians. The problem with Algeria at the moment is that Algeria is slowly becoming a more of an Islamic polity than it ever was in the past, and even after Bouteflika's ouster, the people who took over power are known as the grey people, are the people who behind the scenes were running affairs in Algeria in Bouteflika's time. It was an oppressive tyranny, so nothing seems to have changed. Algeria again is interesting because it ranks 10th largest country in terms of geographical expense in the world, and it is obviously one of the larger countries in Africa. It is the second or the third largest purchaser of military hardware. It maintains a large army. So there is potential for conflict if something goes wrong in this area. So that is where people have said that it would be very, very dangerous not to worry about releasing the tensions in this area, because even if Morocco and Algeria do not go to war, the instability created by them would adversely affect the already spiraling oil and gas prices, and Europe has been looking at alternative sources of gas after the war in Ukraine that could be jeopardized. India has had close relationship with Algeria throughout the period of non-alignment, and both countries at one time were friendly to USSR. So, and India also cannot remain indifferent to a country as large as Algeria being open to the threat of Islamic terrorism or Islamic State getting footholds there. So any instability in Algeria should be a matter of concern for India. The elections in Philippines have drawn our attention to a very interesting aspect of contemporary international relations, which is populism and electoral way to autocracy, dictatorship. Interestingly, the elections in Philippines brought back to power with a landslide victory an inheritor of the notorious Marcos family. Almost 25 years ago, Marcos had to demit office, confronted by violent, large-scale demonstrations in the capital city and elsewhere in the country. His wife, Imelda Marcos, was supposed to be an archetypal corrupt figure who had thousands of expensive shoes, who bought Picassos and kept them as if it was garbage in her house, had a very ostentatious lifestyle. The family had millions, and nobody had thought that the family could ever be rehabilitated in the Philippines politics. But it has happened. The grandson has come over in the family, because the Marco Pacquiao family is one of those ilustrados, which are illustrious ruling families, the ruling elites of Philippines. Now, interestingly, the outgoing president Duterte was again accused of a variety of things. He was accused of not only corruption, he was considered to be extremely unpredictable, extremely brutal. The way he went out in a vigilante fashion to kill drug dealers or to prostitutes or to dissenters to his regime was blatant violation of human rights. And although Philippines has throughout the period of Cold War been a close ally of United States of America. Americans had bases there. It was, at one stage it was jokingly mentioned that Philippines is the 51st state of United States of America. It had become totally Americanized. It had an interesting geopolitical situation. Although it is not a country of regional power, it is either economically or politically, but its geopolitical situation is very sensitive. It, on one side, it Janus-like faces Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. On the other, it opens out on the Pacific. It is a large number of islands which spread out of it, and the southern part is Muslim. Its early history was that of piracy in the Holo Peninsula. It has a disputed border. For long years, it had a disputed border with Malaysia in Kalimantan Utara, northern Borneo, and towards north, in the Visayas, in Luzon, where the sugarcane is grown, the dominant religion is Christianity. So it is a hodgepodge between, some people say very irreverently, it is illegitimate child of Roman Catholic Church, Hollywood, and the American militarism. Now, these are exaggerations, but they have a grain of truth in them. But let's get back to politics. Duterte, when he declared he would not be contesting elections again. His daughter was expected to contest elections. There were hopes that the people wanted change. People wanted a change. They want a restoration of a less autocratic, less dictatorial, less unpredictable state which could manage the economy better. Duterte had behaved very erratically. He had won an arbitration award about a disputed island against China, but was drawing close to China. He did not care if the Americans were offended by this. His conduct to fight COVID was again very, very whimsical. He refused to accept vaccinations from other countries. China he was drawing close to. So it was, now people thought that they wanted a president who would be more predictable, more democratic, more tolerant of dissent, and more efficient to manage the economy. Now, all these things, Marcos Jr., who's called Bong Bong, has promised. But nobody is in a position to judge whether he would not, with very little passage of time, turn out to be as autocratic as his father. It is not only Philippines which raises these issues. If you look at the world over, you see in Brazil, in the other distant part of the world, you have Bolsonaro, who has been for years riding roughshod over all public opinion, all constitutional institutions. His law ministers have resigned, his cabinet ministers have resigned, but just riding on the support of the army, he has followed policies which are detrimental to indigenous people, which are destroying the Amazon rainforest, which might have a very disastrous effect on the climate change for the whole globe. He's suffered from COVID himself, but he was again a vaccine objector. So what accounts for the power of these people who seem to conjure illusions for their people by their populist rhetoric, by their charisma, and people seem to forget bread and butter issues and keep voting them to power. It is not only Bolsonaro in Brazil, it is not only Marcos Jr., Bong Bong in Philippines. Some people would say that Putin himself is a prime example of a populist leader, charismatic leader, par excellence. He seemed to be losing some of his aura, but his rise to power, his 20-year reign was directly related to this. It has happened elsewhere. Maduro in Venezuela, in Obrador in Mexico, and other people who are emerging in different countries. Some people even suggest that the power and glory of the Indian Prime Minister depends on his populist oratory, rhetoric, and his charisma. Undeniable charisma, which nobody in the opposition in India seems to match. But then, is charisma and populism enough to deliver a country from economic crisis, social unrest, and secure citizens against abuse of state power which curtail their human rights, or commitment of war crimes when the country takes part in any activity anywhere else? People would say that even in United Kingdom, the repeated blundering of Boris Johnson in his survival are only possible because Boris Johnson's populist charismatic appeal is not matched by anybody on the Labour. Isn't it true that it is also charisma and populism of the centrist variety of Macron which has got his re-election ensured? So this is what we have to keep thinking, that there is a Western model of democracy, which is electoral democracy, but which becomes distorted when it reaches non-Western shores, and elected office can be assumed by people with dictatorial ambitions, by sheer populism, which replaces policy, rational policy, and you have a world of make-believe which the rest of the world has to cope with. But then the question is that can one say that one country's populism, one individual leader's charisma is good and the others is bad? Even in China, would one agree that it is not the charisma and at times the populist slogans which Xi raises which have ensured his place in the pantheon of Chinese leaders? This list of populist leaders, charismatic leaders, also includes the Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother Gota Rajapaksa, who were returned with a landslide majority only a couple of years back after annihilating the Leyte terrorist attack, but then fell from grace very fast because charisma was not enough to manage either the economy or to ensure social harmony. So this, whether the image manipulation, the narrative being changed, whether it is Imran Khan in Pakistan, whether it is the supreme leader in Iran, can be seen almost everywhere in the world. So this is an issue which international relations experts will have to analyze and cope with for quite some time to come. The role of charisma and its reinforcement of authoritarian regimes which are installed by democratic means and then dismantle the democratic institutions. The Indian Prime Minister has just visited Nepal. He has visited Lumbini, the birthplace of Buddha. And this is ironical that Lumbini has been an irritant in past between India and Nepal. Both countries like to claim the legacy of Buddha, and the birthplace of Buddha is of equal importance to both these countries. Now the interesting thing is there, when Buddha was born in 6th century before the birth of Christ, there was neither Nepal as a nation state nor India as a nation state. There was this belt, the belt of Tarai, where ancient republics flourished and man-made borders did not matter then as international frontiers, and Buddha was born in Lumbini. But most of Buddha's life was set in cast in Indian plains. He gave the first sermon in Sarnath. He traveled all over the country, and following the footsteps of Buddha from Sarnath to Sachi to Rajgir, he found enlightenment in Bodh Gaya and breathed his last in Kushinagar. So the whole Buddhist circuit is in India, and this is one of those ties which should reinforce our relationship with Nepal rather than become an irritant. When Prime Minister Modi was elected for the first time, on his first visit to Nepal, he made a very interesting, stirring appeal that the world doesn't want Yuddha, it wants Buddha. World doesn't need war, it needs the message of peace given by Buddha. And it was very warmly received and he was applauded. And he did not talk of the shared Hindu heritage of Pashupatinath, of Sita's birthplace, of the pilgrimage between Varanasi and Nepal and Pashupatinath and Vishwanath, but he did talk of the Buddha, and this struck a very sympathetic chord in the Nepalese heart. The Nepalese themselves have been troubled by a long-drawn, decades-long civil war between the Maoists, bloodshed, and the message of peace was very welcome. But since then, much water has flown in the Bagmati rivers and the other rivers which flow down from Saryu, Gandak, from Nepal to India. There has been irritants about the river waters, how to settle the distribution of river waters, about the building of large dams which would inundate the fertile lands in Nepal, sharing of the electricity generated. But more disturbing than anything else has been the provocative activities of the Chinese envoy directly interfering in domestic politics of Nepal and provoking the Nepalese to take on an anti-India stance. The worst period was during K.D. Sharma Oli's prime ministership, when a dispute in Limpiadhura, Lipu Lake, Kalapani region of Uttarakhand was raked up. No man's land between Banbasa, Tanakpur and Nepal again became a hotspot. There also was a map which was changed, and the map was shown on the Nepalese flag. Fortunately, good sense prevailed, and these moves were withdrawn. But at the same time, while Nepal is a sovereign country, it has perfect right to develop its relationship with any country it wishes, be it China or something else. But at the same time, India cannot remain a mute spectator to Nepalese territory being used against Indian interest. It has happened in past. There have been planes hijacked from Kathmandu more than once, and the Kandahar flight was a notorious case of this. And the Nepalese Tarai has also been used by smugglers, by flesh traders, by dealers in contraband. This has been, because it's an open porous border. So Indians have to indulge in a very delicate tightrope act. They don't want to appear as interfering in Nepalese politics, internal politics. They don't even want to give good advice because it is likely to be misunderstood as interference. But at the same time, when external powers adversary to India like China are blatantly interfering in Nepalese politics, the Indians should at least signal that India is a long-term friend, a time-tested friend, having a special relationship with Nepal, which allows the Nepalese citizen to be recruited into Indian army. They are not treated as foreigners, but at the same time, the Nepalese should not abuse the provisions of the Special Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which they signed in 1950, which they keep breaking up as an unequal treaty. But when you go over the clauses of the treaty, you see that it is more than a fair treaty, but that's not for us to say again and again and again. So when the recent visit of Prime Minister to Nepal we are discussing, it was to Lumbini, and the Prime Minister made a very subtle diplomatic point that he said he would not land at Bhairava, which is the nearest airport to Lumbini, which has been built by Chinese economic assistance. And the Nepalese Prime Minister, Sher Bahadur Deupa, was going to inaugurate this airport almost at the same time when the visit of the Prime Minister and Modi was taking place. So Prime Minister Modi decided to fly in his helicopter directly bypassing this airport to Lumbini. The Indian Prime Minister was received very warmly by the Nepalese Prime Minister, and the Nepalese ambassador posted in India has recently contributed a long article in Indian newspaper saying that Nepal's relationship with India are very different from what Nepal's relationship with other countries are. And the Nepalese ambassador, who's an economist, talked in terms of the economy of Nepal. He made the point that while people might be worried about what is happening in Nepal, Nepal is not in such a bad position as Sri Lanka. Nepal has learned from the mistakes of neighbors like Sri Lanka. Nepalese realize that they are the next door neighbors of one of the fastest growing economies in the world, especially in Asia, that's India. They remember gratefully the aid which came from India at the time of the 2015 earthquake. And they do realize, the Nepalese do realize that India has a very special relationship with them. But it is for the Nepalese to realize this, not for India to repeat this again and again. So we hope that the visit will reinforce the existing ties between India and Nepal, although the political crisis in Nepal will continue because there is no consensus among the political parties there, and the Prime Minister has had great difficulty in cobbling up a coalition government. The Communist parties keep fighting, the various factions of the Communist parties have different agendas, so all this will continue. So Indians will have to be patient, but at the moment they seem to have set the course again towards a constructive partnership, which should be happy enough for all parties concerned. That's all we have for you this week, but this is quite a bag full. You will have to worry about considering what is happening in Middle East, what can be the spillover effects of the murder of Al Jazeera correspondent, world famous. We'll have to worry about what is going to happen to the Iranian comprehensive agreement to manage the nuclear issue. How is the restructuring of relationship between Israel and the Gulf countries going to impinge an impact on the relationship with Iran? Whether this murder of the journalist is going to once again raise the Palestinian issue to headlines, or again is going to be forgotten. What is going to happen to Hezbollah and Israelis' counterattack against Hezbollah in Lebanon, or trying to cut its roots and supporters? Is Iran going to be a silent spectator to this unfolding, or would it like to raise the ante and say that the world should see that the war in Ukraine has raised the crisis about the energy security, about food security, and Iran needs a relook by the Western countries? But will Israel once again derail the plans of normalization or withdrawal of sanctions with Iran, is something which India will have to watch carefully. One must advise you again to not lose sight of what is happening in the northern tip of Africa, between brewing crisis between Algeria and Morocco. Then we go to the rise of electoral autocracies, dictatorships through democratic means in Philippines and elsewhere in many other countries. And then we look at our neighborhood and what is happening in Nepal, and what are the prospects of building up slowly on a more enduring, irritant-free relationship with this neighbor who is very special to us. Till next week, till we meet again, goodbye and thank you.